Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're wading into a really complex and, frankly, pretty messy global issue. We're talking about the environmental consequences of species that humans have moved around the planet outside their natural homes, alien species, basically, and their impacts. They're just all over the map, wildly unpredictable. So, we've decided to crack open a paper that really tries to bring some order to this chaos. It's called A Unified Classification of Alien Species Based on the Magnitude of Their Environmental Impacts. It came out in 2014. Lead author Tim and Blackburn and colleagues published in PLoS Biology. And this isn't just academic theory. This is about building a really crucial tool for people working in conservation.
Yeah, this paper was definitely needed because if you look at the impacts these introduced species can have, it's kind of dizzying. You see everything. Native species facing higher extinction risks, food webs getting completely rearranged, changes to how nutrients cycle, water systems, even things like making whole landscapes more likely to have severe wildfires.
Yeah.
But here's the tricky part. You could look at, say, 10 different alien species. Maybe 9 of them are, well, relatively harmless. But that one species could be completely catastrophic. And maybe one catastrophe is altering soil chemistry in Europe, while another is spreading disease among fish in North America. How do you even begin to compare those threats? How do you prioritize? There just wasn't a standard ecological threat meter. And that means conservation money, which is always tight, often gets, well, maybe not spent in the most effective way because we lack that common language.
Right, and that's exactly the mission of this Blackburn paper, isn't it? To develop a system that's straightforward, standardized, something specifically designed to help us evaluate, compare, and maybe even eventually predict these environmental impacts. We need to get beyond just slapping the label alien on a species and actually quantify the real threat it poses.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, to really get why it was needed, you have to understand the sort of debate happening at the time. The fact is, a lot of alien species seem to have very little or maybe no detectable impact. And this led some critics to ask, well, why are we so focused just on alien species? Shouldn't we be managing any species causing significant harm, regardless of where it came from?
That seems like a reasonable question. If a native beetle is wiping out more trees than some introduced plant, why pour all the money into managing the plant?
Exactly. And to answer that kind of challenge effectively, you need a robust system like this one. The goal is partly to avoid wasting precious time and resources, managing species that are, ecologically speaking, just kind of they're benign newcomers. This system gives conservationists the tool they need to make comparisons across really different places and types of organisms, fungi, fish, plants, insects, whatever. And that's vital for meeting international goals, like those biodiversity targets focused on minimizing the impact of an invasive species.
And it's really important to flag the boundaries they drew around this classification. They were very specific. It deals only with harmful, deleterious environmental impacts. So we're talking about things that reduce native biodiversity or mess up how an ecosystem functions, specifically hurting the native species living there.
Right. They made a conscious choice to exclude the broader stuff. This tool doesn't try to balance ecological damage against, say, potential economic benefits from that same species. Or the other way around. It's kept very purely as an ecological threat assessment. And that focus, while narrow, is what gives it its scientific power, really. It keeps the scope tight and well-defined.
That tight focus makes the design pretty elegant, actually. They modeled it on a system that pretty much everyone in conservation already knows and trusts. That's the IUCN Red List approach, the one used for categorizing extinction risk for species. So if you think about the Red List as a kind of threat ranking for species themselves, this framework is sort of like a threat ranking system for the damage those species do when they invade new ecosystems.
Yeah, it builds on existing work, specifically frameworks already used by the IUCN's Global Invasive Species Database, or GISD. They essentially took existing criteria for measuring impact and refined them, formalized them into this tiered system.
Okay, so how does it work in practice? The system seems to boil impact down into two main parts. First, there are the impact mechanisms. This is the how. How is the species actually causing change? They identified 13 different ways this can happen. We're talking concrete biological actions here. Things like competition for resources, predation, hybridization with native species, disease transmission, poisoning or toxicity, biofouling like coating surfaces, and even fundamental changes to the physical or chemical structure of the ecosystem itself. And the second part is assigning the species to one of 5 sequential impact categories. This measures the consequence, right? The actual magnitude of the damage caused by those mechanisms.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting, I think.
Yeah.
The absolute core rule they set for assigning that final category. A species always gets assigned to the category that matches the highest level of negative impact recorded under any single one of those mechanisms.
Whoa, hang on. Let me make sure I've got that. So does that mean, say, a plant has almost no effect competing with native plants, doesn't spread disease, doesn't hybridize, minimal impact across 12 mechanisms?
Yeah.
But it happens to be extremely poisonous, maybe causing localized die-offs if eaten. Does it get classified based only on the poisoning?
That's exactly right. If that species causes a, let's say, massive impact through its toxicity, even if it's only minimal in terms of competition or habitat alteration, it gets labeled massive overall. It's a strongly precautionary approach. It stops us from averaging out the impacts and accidentally downplaying a species that has one really catastrophic effect, like extreme toxicity or causing extinction through hybridization, just because its other impacts seem mild. It forces attention onto the worst observed outcome.
That makes a lot of sense, especially when you're deciding where to focus limited conservation efforts. Okay, let's walk through those 5 impact categories then, because they really define the difference between a species you might monitor casually and one you need a major intervention for. So starting at the bottom, we have ML, which stands for minimal impact. This is the best case scenario for an alien species. Basically, no detectable negative effect on the health, survival, or reproduction of native individuals. The species is present, but the ecosystem doesn't really register it negatively. Okay, next up is MI, or minor impact. What happens here?
With MI, the alien species is having some effect. It reduces the fitness of native individuals, maybe slows their growth rate, or slightly lowers their reproductive success. But, and this is the key distinction from the next level up, there's no measurable decline in the overall population size or density of those native species. Think of it as causing some individual stress, but not yet changing the population dynamics.
Right. Then we get to MO, moderate impact. This sounds like where things start to get more serious for the native community.
They do. With MO, the alien species is causing clear, measurable declines in the population densities of native species. So that heavy-feeding introduced insect might actually reduce the population of its host plant by, say, 30%. But the crucial threshold here is that it doesn't cause local extinction or fundamentally alter the overall mix of species in the community. That plant population is smaller, but it's still there, still part of the ecosystem.
Okay, so ML, MI, MO are kind of degrees of stress on individuals or populations, but the top 2 categories, major and massive, they represent really fundamental, serious changes to the ecosystem structure itself.
Exactly. MR, or major impact, is the first level where local extinction comes into play. An MR species causes the local loss, or population extinction, of at least one native species, and this naturally leads to clear changes in the community composition who lives there. But the critical defining feature of major impact is reversibility. The idea is, if you could successfully remove that alien species, maybe eradicate an introduced predator from an island, the native community structure is expected to eventually bounce back towards its original state. The damage is severe, but potentially fixable.
And that leads us to the top tier, MA, or massive impact, the ecological worst-case scenario.
Yes, MA means the alien species causes local extinction, just like MR, but it also produces irreversible changes in the community structure or ecosystem function. Even if you manage somehow to completely remove the alien species later, the ecosystem does not recover its original state. The changes are permanent.
Could you give us an example to make that distinction clearer? What makes damage truly irreversible versus just major?
Sure. Think about an introduced fish predator in a lake. That's classified as major ember carder. It might wipe out a generation of native minnows. But if you manage to remove that predatory fish, maybe through intensive netting or something, it's possible that minnows from connected streams could recolonize, and the food web could eventually resemble its old self. That's reversible damage. Now contrast that with, say, an introduced earthworm in a northern forest that previously had no earthworms. These worms can completely change the soil structure, the leaf litter dynamics, nutrient cycling, fundamentally altering the conditions needed for the native understory plants. Even if you somehow got rid of all the worms decades later, that soil structure is permanently changed. The original plant community might never be able to reestablish this massive irreversible impact.
Wow, okay, that distinction is critical. Now, another challenge they had to address was scale, right? An impact might look huge in one small patch, but insignificant regionally. How did they handle that? The classification relies on impacts assessed at what they call an appropriate local scale, basically, the size where you can reasonably define a native community. But doesn't that create its own problems? If you only look locally, could you miss a cumulative, widespread, but maybe less intense impact? Or overestimate, based on one hotspot.
That is absolutely a key limitation, and they're upfront about it. It's a real challenge. Studies focused on tiny plots might, risk overstating the species' overall impact if you just extrapolate outwards. Conversely, really large-scale regional studies might average things out and completely miss severe impacts that are happening in specific critical habitats within that region. They try to focus on the immediate consequences within a recognizable community, but yeah, that tension between local detail and broader relevance is definitely something users of the system need to keep in mind.
Beyond those 5 main impact levels, ML, MI, MO, MR, MA, they also needed categories for situations where you just can't assign one of those labels. What about when the data isn't there?
Right. They included several other classifications. First is DD, for data deficient. This means either there just isn't enough good information to classify the impact confidently, or, and this is important, not enough time has passed since the species arrived for its impacts to really show up yet. Then there's NA, for no alien populations. Pretty straightforward. Used when there's no solid evidence the species is actually established in the wild outside its native range. And they also added CG for cryptogenic. This is a label for species where we genuinely don't know if they're native or alien in a particular location. This comes up surprisingly often, especially in marine ecosystems with long histories of ship transport. Under the precautionary principle, these cryptogenic species are assessed for impact as if they were alien, but they get the CG tag to flag that uncertainty about their origin status.
Okay, and speaking of uncertainty, just putting complex ecological data into one of 5 boxes must involve some judgment calls. How did they account for the confidence in the assessment itself?
Yeah, that's crucial. They built in a mechanism to formally record uncertainty. You can and should append a confidence level high, medium, or low to every single classification you make. And this reflects the perceived quality and quantity of the evidence underpinning that classification. It forces transparency about how solid the data really is.
This system seems really solid for describing impacts that have already happened. But what about predicting future threats? If a species just arrived and hasn't had time to cause much trouble, it might get rated ML or MI initially. Doesn't that risk creating a false sense of security about something that could become a major problem later?
That's a really critical point, and a key limitation the authors acknowledge. The system, as designed, is not inherently predictive. It primarily reports the worst impact observed so far. So yes, a species that has only recently arrived, or is present in very low numbers, low propagule pressure, as ecologists call it, is very likely to get a low impact rating initially. This rating reflects the historical record of impact, not necessarily the future risk potential.
And what about that tricky issue you mentioned earlier, distinguishing the driver of change from the passenger? If an ecosystem is already stressed by, say, climate change or pollution, an alien species might thrive in those disturbed conditions. Is there a risk the classification blames the alien for changes it didn't actually cause, but just benefited from?
That's another excellent point. And it highlights the system's reliance on the precautionary principle. In situations where an alien species is strongly associated with significant negative changes, but the exact cause and effect is maybe ambiguous, the system generally defaults to assigning a higher impact category to the alien. It essentially errs on the side of caution. It tends to assume the alien is a driver, or at least a significant contributor, unless there's strong evidence it's merely a passenger responding to other factors.
Okay, so summing up, what the Blackburn classification really delivers is that much-needed standardized language, a tool that works across different types of species and different parts of the world. It lets conservationists compare threats more rigorously and helps prioritize action. Moving beyond just saying it's alien to actually grading the severity of its impact, minimal, minor, moderate, major, or massive.
Exactly. And it's designed to be a living system. It's not static. The classifications are meant to be updated as more data comes in or as an invasion progresses and the impacts change over time. So a species rated MI today could certainly be reassessed as MO or even MR in 5 or 10 years if new evidence emerges. And the authors clearly pointed towards future developments. One really key area for future research is trying to estimate the potential impact of species that are currently classified NA, those not yet established as alien. The idea is to look at species that are known invaders and then assess the potential risk of their close relatives or species with similar ecological traits if they were to be introduced.
So what does this all really mean for us? Well, it means that people trying to manage biological invasions now have a shared vocabulary. That's huge. Minimal, minor, moderate, major, massive. It cuts across geography, across types of organisms. But maybe the deeper significance lies in that future potential you mentioned. If we can get better at predicting potential impact before a species even arrives, perhaps by looking at its relatives, we could finally start to get ahead of the curve. It could allow us to focus those limited conservation funds proactively, trying to stop the next potential massive impact invader before it ever gets a foothold. Now that would be a game changer.